From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
They told me to start. Wow, I've got reverb in my own voice. Hello, thank you for coming. Thanks to the Library of Congress. Thank all of you book lovers out there. I'm glad a number of you found your way to this room. We'll try to make it worth your while for these 45 minutes. My feeling is it's going to flee past. We would like to save some time at the end to hear from several of you, to just shoot your hand up and I'll try to find you and you stand up and shout your question out. Informality is the key here. We want this to be a conversation among the three of us, not in any sense presentation. Although our two authors, I'm the moderator. My name is Paul Hendrickson. I am going to, so Mary Dearborn here on my immediate left and Nicholas Reynolds beside her, both authors of recent Hemingway books. Mary's published in May of this year and Nicholas's in March. I'll do a tiny bit more of a formal introduction in a few moments, but I wondered, just to get our juices marinating, whether yours as well as ours, whether I could just toss out a question to Mary and Nicholas, and after they say something about it, maybe I'll have a weigh in as well. I think it's the unanswerable question, therefore let's start out with it. The question: why do we keep returning? Why does Ernest Hemingway seem an almost inexhaustible American subject for biographers and literary historians? Faulkner, yes. Fitzgerald, yes. Emily Dickinson, yes. Robert Frost, yes. But Ernest Hemingway. The industry rolls on and on and on under the American literary night. Mary, please.
Thanks, Paul. What I can say is it's what he wrote. And I think that somehow you're all here, we're all here because we connect in some way to what we read. For me, it's been the short stories. And over again, I can imagine myself even as Nick Adams, even in or inhabit stories like even The Killers in a way that I don't with other writers, and I feel connected in that way. I think that's true for most of us. We come to Hemingway through our reading rather than, I think there's a potent Hemingway myth, which I'll talk about later, but I think we get there through his work.
Good, thank you. Good pithy answer. Nicholas.
So I would say part of the reason, I would agree with Mary, first of all. I started out as a Hemingway reader and lover long before I thought of myself as any kind of biographer. But one of the things that fascinates the biographer is there's so many different Hemingways. And he's so good at so many things in his life. It's almost like there's a Hemingway role for almost any population. You know, are you a sailor? Well, then there's that part of his life. Are you a hunter, a fisherman? Are you a spy? Are you a soldier? There's almost a Hemingway for everyone, and I think that accounts for some of the attraction.
Beautiful again. Both Mary and Nicholas saying the work, and then you find the life in a sense, and Nicholas making the point that there's a Hemingway for everyone because he lives so many lives. My own little take on it might be this. I'm stealing, actually, from a book I wrote, Hemingway's Boat. It's something along the lines of this, I think, that the Hemingway, I totally agree, it's the work, those stories. Big Two-Hearted River was the story that took me over. When I was on a camping in fishing trip in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. I do also think this, the Hemingway myth, however much oversold and devalued, can still powerfully stand in this new century, now 17 years old, for a great many tensions unresolved in American males, and not only males, or so I believe, but I also believe that all of Hemingway's writing, every bit of it, even at its most self-parodistic and papa cult worst, is seeking to be about the living of this life, the doing of this life, the being of this life. And in that sense, the work, and even I am willing to say so much of the coarsened personal history, can be thought of as something spiritual and indeed almost holy. And for those of you who want to laugh me off this stage, feel free. But that is why I think we keep coming back and back. I would like to more formally introduce our two panelists, both of whose books came out, as I said, in recent months, and both of them receiving some wonderful, wonderful reviews. Mary Dearborn, her biography, Ernest Hemingway. Mary received a doctorate in English and comparative literature from Columbia, where she was a Mellon Fellow in the humanities. She is a thoroughgoing American biographer. A whole raft of books, I can't say them all, but The Life of Peggy Guggenheim, Norman Mailer, who some people have accused of being a vest pocket Hemingway. I don't think if you read Mary's book, he stands on his own. Mailer, a biography of Henry Miller, titled The Happiest Man Alive. I said reviews, just to say one. A reviewer said this: a nuanced portrait, a powerful work that draws on new material as well as offering fresh, insightful perspectives on one of American literature's most complicated icons. Nicholas Reynolds, his book is entitled Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy. Nicholas has worked in the fields of modern military history and intelligence for 40 years. He actually is a former United States Marine in the 1970s, serving as an infantry soldier, officer, and then migrating, I think, might be the way to say it, as a historian. He was a colonel in the reserves and in charge of field history and deploying historians around the world. Most recently, he worked as the historian for the CIA Museum, responsible for developing its strategic plan. So his book is more narrowly focused in some ways than Mary's, but we will bat around its ideas. Just to quote one review from the London Review of Books: Reynolds looks among the shadows and finds a Hemingway not seen before. So each of our authors now is going to give the briefest little synopsis, presentation, whatever it might rightly be called, of what they were trying to do with their book. And I think it'll go 4 or 5 minutes at most, and then we'll bat some ideas around, and we'll keep going. Mary, please start.
Hi, thank you, Paul. Thank you for that introduction. And no thanks for that first question. But I did want to talk, I have 3 main points I want to make. And the first is because everyone is curious about it. I'm the first woman to write a biography of Hemingway. And that both means a lot and it doesn't mean much at all. But just one quick thing about why I thought I had something new to say about this as a woman was I started my research in University of Texas at the Harry Ransom Center, and I was looking at Ernest Hemingway's mother's papers. That's what they have there mostly. Grace Hemingway, she's a remarkable woman. what I found there's a very large archive, her letters and all kinds of documents and charts she wrote out, was that it didn't seem to me that the previous male biographers had even looked at them. And there was so much in there. I mean, there was so much that I could have just written a book about Grace alone. Anyway, then I felt there was probably something new for a woman to say. I also felt that there is, as you all know, this is my second point, a very potent Hemingway myth, a very potent legend about Hemingway, the man, the hyper male. It's repeated over and over again, I think, in these biographies by these guys excluded. I think that we all have, I think the writers who write about him and that his readers, we have a lot of stake in seeing him this way. And I'm not sure how useful it is. And I think I think I bring my own baggage to my study of Hemingway, but I don't think I have much investment in that particular myth. So that my third point, which is something I just discovered when I was out promoting the book, it sounds kind of obvious, but that in place of the legend, what do I have? Well, I have the work, but okay. But what I had was this incredibly human person that few of us really know about. We know the work and we sort of know this legend, but we don't know this really human guy who is like, I agree with Paul, and yet I'm not sure that I think it's spiritual. I think it's the flip side. This is a very human person, very talented, but at the same time parodistic of his own talent. An extremely charming guy, but an extremely charming and loving person, and yet he was not able to keep a friend. He wasn't able really to love. All these things at the same time, words and all. He was extremely crippled by several things. He had a number of traumatic brain injuries, and he probably had that cumulative traumatic brain injury problem. He was bipolar. He was an alcoholic, and he was taking various kinds of psychiatric drugs that didn't really work then. So by the end, he was a muddle. He was a very human person. And I found when I was on the road talking about him, I got so protective of him. It was like he was alive and I wanted to protect him. And I think that has its source in this sense that he was this very particular human being. So.
What an interesting thing to say that you found yourself protective of him even as you were doing the biographer's task of ruthlessly dissecting him. Beautiful for me to hear. And thanks for keeping to those 4 or 5 minutes. Nicholas, can you do the same?
Okay, I'll try. I'll start by riffing off something Mary just said, and that is being protective of Ernest. I was doing a show in Boston a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of these late night shows. And halfway through, the guy goes, "Well, wait a minute. Let's stop here a minute. You started out talking about Hemingway. Now you're talking about Ernest, like he's a member of your family." and I think that was a very astute observation on his part, and that's kind of the way I feel now. I don't like everything Ernest did in his life. I admire a lot of things. I don't like other things, but he's still a member of the family, whether like it or not. So I'll tell you a little tiny bit of the history of the book. And I didn't start out to write this book. I was a fed. I was, of various sorts, and I'm used to having people tell me what to do, and then I'll do it as well as I can, and then go on to the next task. And in this case, I was doing something else. I was researching American intelligence in World War II for the CIA Museum, and I remembered that especially Ernest, had been involved in intelligence in World War II, and I wanted to get wanted to refresh my memory on that, and eventually came up to the conclusion that all three Hemingway men who were of military age, more or less, Ernest was actually over military age in World War II, but they all came independently to OSS. So population of 130 million, and OSS never more than 13,000 on any given day, and three Hemingway men show up and they want to join or think about joining. In Hemingway's case, Martha actually put his name forward. And so that kind of lit the fire for me, and then I kept going, pulling on the thread, finishing the work for the CIA Museum, and then continuing on my own. So mostly I was trying to satisfy my own curiosity, especially after I came upon this book, Spies, which is the history, it's published by Yale University Press, and it's the history of Soviet espionage in the United States. And I'm used to going to at that point I was used to going to the index, very sophisticated research technique, and finding Hemingway's name, and it was usually something contextual. You know, it would be around the time of this crisis, Hemingway had published X or Y, or he was a rising star, or he reflected this or that. But no, there's like a sub-chapter, 10 or 15 pages, about Hemingway and the NKVD, which is the predecessor of the KGB, basically Stalin's secret service. And in there, there's a verbatim quote from a KGB/NKVD document that says Ernest Hemingway was recruited for our work for ideological reasons. And that just blew me away. That deeply upset me as a lifelong Hemingway fan, and I started looking for some kind of explanation. You know, what are we supposed to think of Ernest? It's like you find out that one of your relatives is an embezzler, or has committed some other crime, and all the time you've thought, oh well, they're really a fine, upstanding person. And so it was troubling to me, and so I went and searched, tried to find the answer, which comes from many little places. It comes from a letter here, it comes from a quote in a book, it comes from unpublished papers. And initially I thought the story didn't really have legs. I thought it was mostly a World War II story that was an interesting sidebar to World War II intelligence history and to Hemingway biography. And as I got into it deeper and deeper, I found that it had a lasting effect that extended beyond the war. And I also found that it was connected to what he did before the war, and that the pivotal thing in this story is the Spanish Civil War and his dedication to anti-fascism. That's kind of the driver for his, I won't say political thinking, political attitudes. He wasn't a political scientist. He was a novelist, he was an artist, so he really had attitudes more than reasoned political positions. So, long story short, I didn't sit down and write an outline. I just started to write it one day. And pretty soon I had 5 chapters, and then I started getting rejected by agents, which I think happens to all of us who write. And then I found a wonderful agent who liked it enough who believed in it and to take it over the finish line.
Thank you. We'll be circling back to that shortly, because there's much more about the spy business. I love what you just said. You just sat down and started writing. I think the writer starts in chaos and confusion and tries to work himself toward clarity and form. That's what I tell my writing students at the University of Pennsylvania. The reason I'm here moderating, I think, is because I published a Hemingway book, but not this year. It was published in 2011. It's called Hemingway's Boat: Everything He Loved in Life and Lost. And if I can speak even shorter, in a minute and a half, about what that book is about, to give you some sense of context. I think I was trying to write a book about the strange, sad distance from a Brooklyn boatyard named Wheeler Shipyard to a tight oak-paneled entryway in a bunker-like house in Ketchum, Idaho, when the world went away from a suffering man in fractions of a second. Hemingway's boat is largely the story of the span of years between the first week of April 1934 and the first week of July 1961. But the narrative doesn't always stay there. In my quirky way, I kept wanting to travel elsewhere. No human history ever proceeds in a straight line, perhaps least of all Ernest Hemingway's. His prose was wonderfully rooted in geography and linear movement, but his life, like his boat, beat against so many cross currents. It was trying to come to a modest understanding of an almost insanely complicated life through the narrative lens of something in the material world he loved very much, a possession that was intimately his and he hers for 27 years, which were the final 27 years. Her name was Pilar, and she lasted through 3 wives, the Nobel Prize, and all his ruin. My aim, if I had a stated aim, was to try to lock together the words Hemingway and boat in the way that the locked together and equally American words DiMaggio and bat or Satchmo and horn quickly mean something in the minds of a lot of people. The material thing in question was not a figment or a dream or somebody's psychosexual interpretation. She was actual. And that is Hemingway's boat. When we started here, I said spiritual and almost holy. I would also say, just as Mary has reminded us, and Nicholas too, that at every turn, Hemingway betrayed himself. These high human aspirations, which he continually, somehow, for some psychic reason, and we're not psychiatrists, he was needing and wanting to sabotage. Nicholas, back to you for a moment. On the spycraft, being recruited by the Soviets, you found this out and that got your attention. He even had a code name, right?
He was Argo.
Argo was his code name. But so the audience can be clear, what did he do as a Soviet spy? No money was exchanged. Did he actually contribute anything in actual spycraft for the Soviets? This is during the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets are the clearly most anti-fascist group out there. Is that true? So Hemingway, who's just politically turning anti-fascist, would have a reason to be enamored of this, but what happened? So
the way I'd like to think about this is when he was with the Soviets in Spain, it was like dating. It was like getting to know the espionage and intelligence business, and he did things for them there on a casual basis that they would have wanted after recruiting him. So he did a propaganda film. He spoke to people on their behalf, tried to get them to hew the company line. He wrote for Pravda. There's a couple of articles that he would probably prefer us not to remember. And he participated in a paramilitary operation that drove the plot of For Whom the Bell Tolls later on. So those are the kind of things that the Soviet intelligence, which is and Russian intelligence, it's been happening for decades, maybe, well, now about 100 years. You know, it's an enterprise that does classical espionage, which is steal the government official, steals the secrets from the safe, turns them over to the bad guys, and other things that are much more amorphous. They're about influence. They're about lower level confidences, not state secrets, and that's the sort of thing they were looking for from Hemingway. And so the recruitment comes at the end of 1940 or possibly the very beginning of 1941, And then it's like getting married. So before he was dating the Soviets, and that was fun and exciting and whatnot. And now all of a sudden he's married to the Soviets. He understands what recruitment is, and he almost immediately takes a deep breath and says, I wonder if that was such a good idea. So as a recruited Soviet spy, he does almost nothing except agree to further meetings and make a number of meetings with Soviet spies who mostly are asking him, say, you remember when you signed up with us and you said you'd do whatever you could to help us? Well, we're ready now. And he would say, I'm ready too, and I'll get on it tomorrow. But somehow tomorrow never came.
Can I break in here? This spying story that Nicholas traces the book doesn't begin and end with the Spanish Civil War and his flirtation, if that's the word, with the Soviets. It comes up through spying for working on America's side during World War II and his fishing boat Pilar. And then later on, so I want Mary to be able to jump in fact, maybe switch it to Mary now. But later on, Hemingway's extreme paranoia, whether his earlier spying adventures, Soviets spying for America, they were going to lob grenades down the conning towers of German subs. What a loony sounding idea with his little fishing boat. He weaponized highlight players, right, from Cuba. So Nicholas traces this all the way through, and then the extreme paranoia in the 50s, when Hemingway is convinced that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI are tailing him at every turn. Mary would have a lot to say about this. I wonder, though, if we can, for a minute, get back. Mary, I want to tread lightly because you make a point of saying in your book that yes, and the promoters, the publicity people said you're the first woman ever to do a full biography of Ernest Hemingway. True fact, the first full-length biography, period, in 15 years. But Mary said, this doesn't necessarily mean that much. Mainly, I find I am interested in different aspects of Hemingway's life from the ones that drew his previous male biographers. Very, very deep in Mary's book. We're in the late 400 pages of her book. You said something that hit me a dead center, and I wanted to noodle it a little and congratulate you. I have deep feelings about this. You said Ernest was extremely brave to take up such issues in his fiction. She is talking about the posthumous novel, The Garden of Eden. And for those of you who are Hemingway aficionados or even casual students, you possibly know that book is so deeply invested in gender issues, transgender issues. So you said he was extremely brave to take this up. And I'm really thrilled, pleased, grateful that you put it that way. Would you say a little more about that? And Nicholas, feel free in a minute to jump in.
Leave it to the English professor.
I think it is extremely brave. I think anyone who's tried, this is not the case with me, but people who come out to their families as gay or decide what they want is to be with somebody of the same gender, I think that takes incredible courage. And to admit to what you would like to do in bed takes some people a lifetime or so, I gather. And Ernest, I think, was transfixed by gender issues. And by that I mean of switching gender roles sexually, but in all kinds of other ways as well. And there was one night when his fourth wife, Mary, was away, and Hemingway was kind of obsessed with hair color. This went with the being interested in changing sex roles, because he would imagine in Garden of Eden himself and his female partners cutting their hair the same length to look alike so that different ones could be the boy or the girl, or coloring it. So he was really obsessed with coloring hair. And the fourth wife, Mary, was blonde, and he was just, it's almost comical in each letter. Well, I think you could go a little more ash blonde, or is it moonlight blonde that I'm thinking of? It was something that transfixed him. But anyway, she was away, and one night he dyed his hair red, and he'd been drinking. And, and then he wrote about it to Mary the next day, and he said, I woke up and I said, oh my God, and what are the servants gonna think? What are the guys gonna think? What am I gonna do? And he said, and then I said to myself, this is our one and only life. And that's something that he said a lot in the last decade of his life. And I think not when he was feeling suicidal. He felt that this was we only live once. I mean, it's a cliche. And that he would go after what he wanted sexually, or the fantasies, and he would air them in his fiction. He never would have published Garden of Eden in his lifetime. He didn't believe it could be published. But he wanted to write it out. I think that, yes, I think that is extremely brave.
He wanted to write it out. You see, here's where I come down on that. So many Hemingway scholars, writers, would-bes out there saying, aha, we've caught him red-handed. He left this material behind. Wasn't he the first one who would have known that all of the posthumous gravediggers would have discovered this material? So I think the missing link in so much Hemingway writing is not willing to see and acknowledge and say, as you just said in your text, that how extremely brave of him to do this. Nicholas, your book's not about any of these issues, but you had to have thought about this.
A couple of things come to mind, and one is that he did live so fully. That ties in with what we said earlier about the different Hemingways. And you look at Ernest's life, you see a guy who lived it to the fullest extent possible. And that's one of the things that it's a different way of saying the same thing, that there were many Hemingways, but there was always a Hemingway living very fully. The other thing that comes to mind is he said at one point that he and Gregory, his transgender son, were the closest of his sons. He understood Gregory's psyche or identified it with it more closely than either Jack or Patrick.
There's a very powerful thing Norman Mailer said. Mary Dearborn has a whole book about him. Mailer said, "It may even be that the final judgment on his work may come to the notion that what he failed to do was tragic, but what he accomplished was heroic. For it is possible he carried a weight of anxiety within himself which would have suffocated any man smaller than himself." That was a very resonant quote for me in what I was doing when I was working on Hemingway. Elaine Showalter, who reviewed Mary's book in the New York Times and talked about Nicholas's as well, at the end of her review, she said, we all have been subscribing to this business that his insides were eaten out by the diseases of fame, this sin of pridefulness, the curses of megalomania, the onslaughts of bipolarism. But Showalter's point also was, in the Garden of Eden, he's revealing perhaps a man at the end of his life, when he's all used up, trying to tell new truths about himself. So you could almost flip the tragedy upward. Because isn't it so essentially brave and beautiful? I knew this was going to flee by. I think we have about 8 minutes. Somebody from the audience asked something. If you don't, we'll continue here. Yes, shout it out, sir. Shout it out, quickly.
This question is for Nicholas Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds, back in the 50s, Hemingway was in Cuba, overseas. Yet, contacts of a kind with the rebels in the mountains. In Spain, in 58, he was acting nuts. CIA, Yale, Princeton men. Well, the ones that were into literature, for them Hemingway was God the Father. And God the Father, with his leftist past in the 30s, still has some leftist contacts in the 50s. And Spain, like I say, nobody knows what he's going to say or do next. Is there any evidence that he was under surveillance either in Spain, Cuba, or anywhere else by the CIA, where the CIA file exists about Hemingway? Is that a possibility?
So when I got to a point in my work, so yes, I worked at CIA, yes, I had access to CIA computers, but once I was doing work on Hemingway for myself, I couldn't just roam the files and call it up. So I FOIA'd Hemingway and eventually got a response, and the response to me indicates that he did not have a CIA file. So, maybe it's out there, maybe it's not, but I doubt it. FBI file, he does have an FBI file.
It's thick, right?
Well, yes and no. It's 128 pages. It's on the FBI website, but it shows that their interest was moderate compared to some of the people he worked with, like Joris Ivens, the Dutch communist photographer. His file, Joris's file, is 600-700 pages. So I don't have enough time to go into Hemingway and J. Edgar Hoover, but in the end, J. Edgar Hoover writes a thing on Hemingway's file saying, this wasn't such a bad guy after all.
But even if it's 128 pages, 2 pages, if you could make you a paranoid man, if you think somebody's watching you, if you're susceptible to those diseases. Sir?
Yes, as you all know, the New York Times...
A little louder.
As you all know, the New York Times has a thing every Sunday where they ask authors if they could have a literary dinner party, who would they invite? Yeah. And I've always, while Hemingway is my favorite author both for writing and because of his fascinating life, I've always been a little concerned, would I really want him as a dinner party guest? Because I feel he might suck all the air out of the room and everybody in there.
Right.
So since y'all are the experts on him in the world right now, could convince me that I would want him as a guest at my dinner party.
Hard. Mary, tackle that.
I'm not sure. I don't know. I think I would not ask him to a dinner party. He'd probably drink too much and start telling the same stories over and over. Actually, I'm not kidding, really. But if I could have dinner with one author, one-on-one, that would be Hemingway. And, I'd like to talk to him about stuff where nobody could overhear us. And,
They're flashing the 5-minute card. We'll see what we can get. Ma'am, put the microphone down to your face.
We were in Key West recently and took the tour of the house, and so I had to buy your book, Ms. Dearborn. And because I've worked with young children, there were 2 things in the book that just really were red flags for me. One, that his mother would hold him and shoot a gun so that he would hug her tightly. So I think the picture on your book was pretty obvious as what happened after that. The other one was that the 2 children, his sister and he, were sometimes both dressed as girls and then other times both dressed as boys. So I haven't finished the book, but I would assume that a lot of what's happened to him came from those early experiences.
We can go 45 minutes on that.
Okay, I'll just keep it brief and say, yes, it definitely did. But a lot of what happened in the Hemingway family was genetic. He lived by the gun, he died by the gun. His father shot himself with a gun. And fully half of the Hemingway children, many believe, killed themselves. 3 out of 6, that's a lot. That's genetics. That's a lot of other things went into it, but that'll have to do for now.
In this pious Midwestern suburban Chicago family of 8, 6 children and 2 parents, at least half took their lives by their own hand. It was encoded in the DNA. Sir?
I read all 3 of your books, and they were all great for different reasons, so I'm glad to see you here today. Quick question. Did he ever get close to publishing any of the books published after his death? And what did Scribblers and his family do to try to get him to finish those books?
Okay, that's a good question. Scribblers was not so keen on what he was doing in the second half of his career, and I'm thinking especially of Across the River and Into the Trees, which was really a colossal failure. And Max Perkins, who you've all heard of, editor of Genius, he had died, and nobody was there to sort of say, to rein Ernest in, or to say that's not your best work. Now he did, at the same time, he wrote The Old Man and the Sea, which won him back a lot of his audience. And the story I like to tell is that for all that I think his talent fell apart and Scribblers didn't know what to do with him, on the other hand, he put together in the last year of his life one of his most charming books, A Moveable Feast, about his life in Paris. It's totally made up and full of falsehoods, but it's a charming book, and he still had it together. But Scribblers had really lost control of him, wouldn't you say?
Yes, yes. You know, another thing that moves me, we talked about facing these, if the deepest things that are moving you toward the end of your life are these gender possibilities and transgender, and you're willing to write it, not publish it, but write it and leave it behind. The other thing that moves me so tremendously is that Ernest Hemingway went to his writing desk every morning that he could in all those last years, knowing that so much of it was a shadow of what he had formerly written. That in itself is a heroic act. Nicholas, say the last word.
Yeah.
Well, I think of the body of work that he left more or less as the inheritance for his family. He was taxed to death during his life. Yeah. The house was, he must have realized by then, the house was unlikely to be a property that the Hemingway family could dispose of. And he's got this body of work that he leaves for them to publish posthumously. And you know, my educated guess is that's something he's leaving for Mary and the boys.
Yeah, I think that's a practical and realistic answer. We're done.
We're done. Oh well.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.